Well, yeah. Did you want to say a word about Hillary and Jeb Bush? It looks like...
Well, Jeb is... I guess I suppose I flatter myself. I am at least one of the prominent opponents of a Bush dynasty. I've certainly tried to do that. And if you take a look at this unauthorized biography of George H.W. Bush, right, Bush the Elder, probably the one thing just about everybody who's politically aware knows about the Bush dynasty now is the fact that Prescott Bush, United States Senator Prescott Bush of Connecticut, the father of George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, right, 41st president, this Prescott Bush had been the managing partner of the Brown Brothers Harriman Investment Bank in Lower Manhattan on Lower Broadway. And in the course of 1940, 1941, 42, he was exposed as being the United States banker for a man called Fritz Thyssen, Thyssen. And Thyssen, well, Thyssen says it himself. He has an autobiography which is entitled I Paid Hitler by Thyssen. So there it is. And he did. And he goes through this, but the thing that he doesn't tell you in his book was unearthed in, first of all, press reports, and then later in official action. There was something called the Union Banking Corporation in New York City, and one of the people on the board of that was this same Prescott Bush. And the Union Banking Corporation was a conduit of funds from interests, holdings of Thyssen in the United States, in Wall Street, and so forth. That money went through the Union Banking Corporation to a Dutch bank called the Bank for Trade and Maritime Commerce. I'm translating as best I can from the Dutch. And then on to Germany, where it was used to finance Hitler's seizure of power. And there's a supplementary track that some of the weapons used by the Nazis to clear the streets of their opposition also came from U.S. arms companies in Connecticut under the control of a family ally of the Bush dynasty. And this all came to a head then. The alien property custodian, a guy by the name of Crowley, in October 1942, if memory serves, he expropriated the Bush family in the sense that their shares of stock in Union Banking Corporation and a couple of other subsidiary things, those were confiscated. And this was done because the Union Banking Corporation was an enemy alien dominated by German and Hungarian Nazis. So that was what was applied to the to Prescott Bush. So this put a shadow over the family, although they got the money back. Apparently they got the money back with interest. That part is a little bit harder to trace, but the shares were then restored later on. But you can imagine, a family, it's October 1942, United States has been at war for almost a year, and they're still maintaining this, this banking option for somebody who by now, Thyssen had tried to flee, right? He got out of Nazi Germany, but still working for him. And that was written up. You can go back and find it in the New York Herald Tribune and some other papers of the time, right? Thyssen has huge cash stash in Lower Manhattan, and lo and behold, it's the Union Banking Corporation, and it's Prescott Bush. Now, this is, of course, typical. This is not an isolated case. There's a whole array of U.S. ruling class figures who were deeply sympathetic, certainly to Mussolini, without any doubt, but then also to Hitler, some of the more radical ones. And we could go through that list too, but why don't we just focus right now on Prescott Bush. So that's the dynasty that you're dealing with. And then it goes on to George H.W. Bush. One or two interesting things about him. If you remember the smoking gun tape of mid-1974, the one that actually forced Nixon to resign, the one that contains the prima facie case of obstruction of justice that forced Nixon to throw in the towel, This is not, many people, when you hear smoking gun tape, they think, oh, the one that was erased. No, the one that was not erased, because the details are what gets them. It's Nixon saying, we're going to organize obstruction of justice, in effect. He says, the Texans are going to have to testify to this, this, and this, right? And he's talking to Haldeman and Ehrlichman and other people in the White House on the famous White House tapes. Well, the Texans include George H.W. Bush, who at this point was the head of the Republican National Committee during Watergate, right? George H.W. Bush was a very important figure in Watergate. Read the chapters about that. This is Bush himself, right? Bush had been most probably one of the CIA managers of the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. That's in 1961. But now it's much later. It's 1974, and George H.W. Bush is the head of the Republican National Committee, and he comes on as a supporter of Nixon. He then turns against Nixon, wants him out, but he's also then very shocked by the smoking gun tape, and that's got nothing to do with Nixon. It's that George H.W. Bush realizes that he could be investigated and perhaps accused, indicted, for some kind of obstruction of justice, because this was the money that was coming, the famous follow the money. That money was coming from a group of donors in Texas, including this guy Liedtke. These are all people that show up later on in the Texaco Pennzoil takeover. Anyway, that guy Liedtke was one of Bush's partners of Zapata Petroleum and Zapata Offshore. So complicated story, but the idea is the smoking gun tape features references to George Bush, although not by name, as the Texans.
Well, Webster, I also want to mention, and I mean, I've heard you talk about this before, that George H.W. Bush became vice president under Ronald Reagan, and, of course, Reagan was shot. There was an attempt on his life, and that very night, one of Bush's sons was slated to have dinner.
He was scheduled. This is Neil Bush, right? The Silverado Neil Bush, right? Sort of the black sheep, the one who was always getting into scrapes and so forth. Well, in this case, Neil Bush had become a friend of Hinckley's brother. So Scott Hinckley, the elder brother of the shooter, John Hinckley, was a friend of Neil Bush, and they were scheduled to have dinner the night that Reagan was shot. So that dinner was called off, as far as we know. But it came out in the Houston Post and the Rocky Mountain News, two newspapers that no longer exist, by the way. So that was obviously very embarrassing. And you'd think in a government of laws that there would have been, an investigation, to be sure, right? To remember, it's not just impropriety or illegality, it's the appearance of impropriety or illegality. So any government of laws would have immediately probed that, but of course it was covered up. And if you're hearing this for the first time, well, go and make your contribution and get a copy of this book. There are any number of other ones. If you remember Holden, Caulfield, and The Catcher in the Rye.
Yes.
Okay, a lot of people are very avid readers of this book. You'll remember that there's a scene where Holden Caulfield, I think accompanied by one of these girls that he's trying to meet, he goes to the theater and he views a matinee performance of a play on Broadway with Alfred Lunt and Lynn Fontaine. And he comes out with his date there, and they go into the lobby, and he says, there's this guy named George from Andover who's the biggest phony in a checkered vest, and he's such a phony that he has to rock back on his heels and, sort of get ready to let fly with his latest phony statements. Well, my argument is that that's George H.W. Bush from Andover, right, with a high-pitched whining voice. And, of course, J.D. Salinger was somebody who traveled in these circles of the prep school universe and might well have met him, right, under the clock in the old Biltmore or whatever it was. So it's a treasure trove of all kinds of things. It's an internet legend. It's been copied, downloaded, uploaded, I guess by now thousands of times. People are welcome to look at it. It's supposed to be a public service, but you want to get the nice printed book for your library, so please do make a contribution.
We're talking about, of course, Webster's classic, George Bush, The Unauthorized Biography, about 650 pages, a classic. Our gift to you today for a $50 donation to WBAI. You can pick up that book by calling 212-209-2950. 212-209-2950. Also online at give2wbai.org, and the 2 is the number 2. You know, Webster, I was just remembering a couple of years ago when I was flipping through this book, George Bush, The Unauthorized Biography, I happened to notice, and you didn't even remember it yourself, that the date of George H.W. Bush's New World Order speech before the United Nations was September 11th. I believe the year was 1991. So there's a little synchronicity there for you.
Yeah, who knows?
Very strange coincidence, huh?
Certainly. Although there are a limited number of days in the year, so you got to factor that in too. But the thing is, obviously I don't believe in numerology, but when you look at the Bush family, this is Freemasonry, okay? When you say skull and bones, what does skull and bones mean? Prescott, George, H.W., George W., skull and bones, right? All Yale, skull and bones. This execrable thing. John Kerry, today, skull and bones. It's very dangerous. This is probably the group of any small society of that dimension. They've done more damage to the United States over the past 100 years than 120 years than any other, right? They've been an absolute disaster. I would think that anybody from Skull and Bones would be disqualified to be as the Constitution says, to hold an office of profit or trust under the United States. In other words, you can't be a public servant. You can't be certainly appointed to any post if you have a background in Skull and Bones. But there it is.